Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
I'm Tali Rosenbaum.
And today I'm in my house, and Tali, for reasons which I don't have to explain, is in her house. I'm recording her over Skype. How are you holding up, Tali?
We're doing all right under the circumstances. How about you guys?
Doing okay. I'm getting to know my kids very, very well, which is a lovely thing. So today, Tali, we're going to speak about intimacy in times of stress and quarantine, and obviously we'll be speaking about the current novel coronavirus in particular. Before we delve into today's topic, we want to thank all of our listeners for listening to Intimate Judaism. We appreciate your sharing and promoting this podcast. We are excited. This podcast, as we've mentioned before, has been reaching an ever larger audience, and with your help, we'll continue to help people all over the world open conversations about sexuality, intimacy, and Judaism. Please continue, therefore, to share and tell people about this podcast. Please visit our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archives, show notes, a free men's mikveh list, and more. Please tell people as much as you can about this podcast so the word gets out. Share it on Facebook, Twitter, or any other way you think can work. And finally, we originally hoped to announce something on this episode, but with everything going on, we are slightly delayed. We are making an Intimate Judaism Patreon site, which will hopefully be up quite soon, where you can support this podcast and get some cool free stuff, extra episodes, Facebook Lives, and more. Stay tuned, that is coming soon. Finally, please continue to send us your questions and comments to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Tali and I apologize in advance. We receive a lot of correspondence. While we do read everything, we cannot respond to everyone individually. Make sure to visit jewishcoffeehouse.com as well as talirosenbaum.com.
Two things about what you said. One, I think that before we begin, we have to just acknowledge the impact of the coronavirus. These are extremely uncertain times, and I think that there is a wide range of realities and reactions. There are those people out there who do not have it in their heads to be listening to an Intimate Judaism podcast. There are plenty of other people who have nothing but time on their hands right now to catch up on all the episodes of Intimate Judaism. But I do want to acknowledge, first of all, the people who are not well, because it's really important to send a refuah shlema, l'kol cholei amenu, to all the sick people, not only Jewish ones, cholei amenu v'cholei ha'olam,
Amen.
the whole world. Also to those who are stuck at home, and to also acknowledge that isolation for many of us is a temporary experience. But for others, this is how they live all the time, feeling lonely and alone. And there are those who can't leave their homes that easily in normative times. So I think that we are really learning a lot during this period. I know I'm learning a lot.
That's a really important point.
And just to move over to what you said about the Patreon site, I'm wondering if you could explain to our listeners, I'm not that familiar with it, what exactly it is.
So Patreon it's a company through which creators are able to publicize their creations. Very often podcasts are among those creations. And people who really like it and want to support them are able to financially support them, either a lot or sometimes very little. And in exchange, the creators then give them extra, it could be merchandise or extra episodes, additional live episodes, other things like that. So when we set it up, we'll be having extra episodes of Intimate Judaism available for our Patreon subscribers as well as other stuff.
Okay, great.
So Tali, let me start off today by mentioning an interesting textual anomaly in Parshat Noach, because before the Mabul, before the flood, Hashem told Noach in Perek Vav, Pasuk Yud Chet, 6:18 in Breshit, Vakimoti briti itach, I will keep my covenant with you. Uvata el hateva, you should come into the ark. Ata uvanecha, v'ishtecha uneshevanecha itach. You, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Whereas after the Mabul, after the flood, in Perek Chet Pasuk Tet Zayin 8:16, Hashem tells Noach, Tsei min hateva, leave the ark, ata v'ishtecha uvanecha uneshevanecha itach. You, your wife, your sons, and their wives. So in the first pasuk, before they go into the ark, Hashem tells Noach to go in with his sons and his wife and their wives. implying somehow that the men and women are separate. But when they leave, Hashem commands them to go out together. Noach with his wife and his sons with their wives. So the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Kufchet Amud Bet, 108b, and it's also cited by Rashi in several places in the Parsha, says that this teaches us that during the time of the Mabul, during the time of the flood, intimate relations were forbidden between man and woman, between Noach and his wife and his sons and their wives. And this is because in a time of tsa'ar, in a time of agony, when the world is in mourning, so to speak, intimate relations are forbidden. Now, I don't want to go in that direction and say that that's true now, because there's also a different perspective. In fact, a couple of days ago, I spoke to a Rav of mine, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, on a different podcast called Orthodox Conundrum. And one of the questions which I asked him about the situation is whether people should postpone weddings, given that they can't really have weddings in large groups. In fact, last night, a cousin of ours had a wedding in New York in someone's backyard. And his reaction was that we should not postpone weddings because, on the one hand, yes, this is an Eitzar Li'akov. This is a difficult time, a time when everybody is worried. It's not really the time to be thinking about intimate relations and simcha and these other elements. But on the other hand, from a very different perspective, we need to have hope. We shouldn't be despondent. We shouldn't look at this time as the end is nigh, the world is ending. There's nothing more hopeful than a marriage, than a couple being together intimately. And for that reason, it's important to maintain these smachot. And yes, people should have weddings and they should have bar mitzvahs, etc., etc. So even though there is certainly a real approach in Judaism, the Noach approach, that when people are in pain, couples should not be intimate with each other because that's not the right mindset they should be having. I don't think that's the proper way of reacting to this current situation when people need hope, when people want to be together, when people are looking for things to bring them up, not things that will make them more upset. At the same time, Tali, even though intimacy is allowed at times like this, it still is very difficult in stressful times. Can you elaborate on the problem of stress in intimacy and perhaps offer some solutions to the problem?
Yeah, I think that when you were talking about the Gemara and Sanhedrin on the different textual versions of before they went into the Teva, into the ark, and then when they came out of the ark, what I was thinking was that there's almost something about being in this very small enclosed place. Yes, it's also during a time of existential uncertainty, but it's also a very small place of shelter, which you are surrounded by all your children and every animal species by two. I kind of looked at that as maybe also being somewhat of a situational or technical or even privacy issue, as opposed to after the flood, where not only is it far more appropriate to find your space for intimate relations, I think that there's also this kind of spiritual, now we can grow, now we can procreate, now we can continue our lives.
Right.
So that's kind of what I was thinking of in terms of not just simply you're not allowed to have sex in the times of tsa'ar, in the times of pain and trouble, but also that having sex or procreating or being together in this way of vitality, this way of creativity, is a way to heal, is a way to be resilient after a trauma. I mean, the Mabul, the flood, was a type of a trauma, and it's existential, and really life ceased to exist the way that it existed before.
In fact, let me just add, because you're saying that even though Hashem told Noach to leave together with his wife, in the pasuk which describes what actually happened, it says that Noach left with his sons and his wife left with her daughters-in-law, meaning that they still were not ready. Even though it was technically allowed, according to what God said, there's no prohibition anymore on intimacy, they were still traumatized and they didn't want to have intimacy. And it took God to tell Noach, you have to go back. You cannot be despondent. You can't let the world lie barren from now on. And then after this, God tells Noach, pru urvu, you have to multiply again. Whereas it's not simply an option to go back with your wife. You actually have to overcome this trauma. You have to overcome the stress.
Yeah, I guess you could look at it that way. I mean, I don't tend to look at it in terms of what God is telling people to do, but more like this is what happens. Mm-hmm. This is what will happen. God is kind of saying, well, this is what's going to happen now because this is human nature. And so that this is kind of the narrative of pre-event, the event itself, pre-event being the men go in separately, the women go in separately. And again, I think there probably are a lot of technical issues there. And then post the event, there's, okay, now a lot of things are going to happen. I think that people, whether or not, and I think this brings us now to our discussion, I think it's really very personal and very situational. People all respond very differently. And this is true in terms of touch. This is true in terms of conflict. One of the things that I find very interesting with the couples that I'm working with is the fact that some couples are stepping up to the plate, so to speak, in terms of their relationships with one another in this time of crisis, whereas other couples who are high conflict couples, their conflict is even greater because of the surrounding variables of stress and having children at home and the uncertainty, not knowing.
What would be solutions to couples who feel that the stress is impeding their ability to be intimate with each other?
Well, I think that people don't think in terms of what are the solutions for the fact that my intimacy is being impeded. First, I think we have to realize that when we are in a time of such uncertainty and there's so much unknown, we go kind of into a more survivalist state of being. We're not always thinking with our higher conscious self. I'm thinking about things like the basics. We all think about different things like who is, we have the word chiyuni in Israel, which is what's necessary. Who are the necessary people that come into your home? So like, is your nanny necessary? Is your cleaning lady necessary? Is your manicurist necessary? What appointments are necessary? Is it necessary to go out for food? But, some people might be thinking about their gray roots growing in. I'm not one, but I'm saying some people might be.
It's possible.
What do you do? So I think that we need to recognize that our, hierarchy of needs begins to change, and we begin to be very concerned for some of the very basics of our survival. And everybody reacts to survival differently. One funny thing that occurred, and I generally don't like to give too many patient scenarios, but one of my clients who is a young married man who's quite anxious as it is, he's just anxious. He catastrophizes, which really means he's always thinking the worst. And he always feels like this great burden. He comes in, he slouches down in the chair, like the whole world is on his shoulders. And he came in the other day and I said, when I was still in my office, now I'm doing everything video. So it was the last day that I was working in my office, and he came in, he slouched down on the chair, and I said, so how are you doing with all this? And he said, I feel great. I feel strangely vindicated.
Okay, good for him.
So funny. I told him, I said, I have to use that. Kind of hilarious. Yeah. So everybody reacts in a different way. And I think that a lot of people who are OCD, interestingly, are not taking this the way I would have thought that they would take it. They just said, well, that's just me anyway. I'm always like that. That's not a problem for me to wash my hands every time I touch somebody. It's just been a very fascinating time for understanding human behavior and understanding the diversity of human behavior, and also understanding the diversity of two people within a couple.
Right. I was going to ask you about that because I'm sure it's very common that each member of the couple is in a different place. One may be very nervous. One may be very relaxed about it. Or alternatively, one might be very nervous and therefore unable to think about sex. And the other spouse might be, I need to have sex just to relax. What would a couple do? What should a couple do in a case like that?
Let me address that. Let me put aside the sex issue first, and let me just talk about the issue of reassurance. Generally, when we talk about intimacy, we talk about things like respect. We talk about things like mutual ability to listen, to provide empathy to one another. There are certain elements. And one of those elements is to provide reassurance. Now, one of the things that can happen in a relationship is one person has a lot of anxiety and the other one becomes their soother, their kind of Prozac. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times in a relationship, you've got one spouse who is more takes the role of everything is going to be okay, honey. And the other one is the one who kind of gets to worry and catastrophize. And one thing that might happen in these situations is that the spouse who is generally the more soothing one will need soothing himself or herself. And so there might be some role changing that's necessary.
Some sort of dynamic almost.
A change in the dynamic, which almost is a change in the stasis of the whole system. And so what we need to do is be very, very aware at all times. And again, this is not easy to do in times of crisis, but we need to be aware of what's going on with us. Because to answer the second part of your question, which is about what to do when one partner wants more sex and the other doesn't, everything that we have dealt with so far on this show, these are the same issues that will be dealt with now, because that's a question that we've dealt with now. Not being able to touch your partner when you're nida is a question that we've dealt with now. These are all going to be magnified in a way during these times. So if in the past, what we have talked about over and over again is communicate, 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 it's going to be even more important during these times to be able to communicate. But it's also really important for each person on an individual level to be very self-aware of what he or she is feeling. Because when we internalize our feelings, and we tend to do that in times of stress, we're wired to react in order to survive. So we're not always very in tune with what we might be feeling. We might be walking around for 3 days complaining and being in a bad mood, but really what we need is to be calmed and soothed by our partner, but we don't recognize that enough to be able to say that. So self-awareness is really important, because when we're self-aware, we can say, I'm feeling stressed, or I'm feeling afraid, or I'm feeling cooped up, I'm feeling bored, whatever it is. And then when we can express it, then we can expect our partner to be able to address it. We cannot expect our partner to read our minds. So for my clients, for example, where that's a big thing, that expectation that my needs be preempted, that my needs be addressed even without my saying them, it's not a logical expectation. And I tell my clients, I try to be curious about why they would expect that their partner would already know what they want, because really only babies and toddlers get that. When we grow up and we have language, we need to be able to ask for what we need. But without going into why, usually it has to do with some childhood wounds of not having been nurtured or taken care of. Without going into why, the fact is that we can't really expect it, and we need to be able to be very direct about what we're feeling and what we're needing. Okay, so having said that, again, you asked a specific question about sex, and I want to just point out that, again, it's not just about sex. First of all, people have a lot of questions about sex. People want to know, is it okay to be having sex with my partner? Now, obviously, if you are pretty much self-quarantined or not really quarantined, but stuck at home with your partner, with your husband or with your wife, and neither of you feel ill or are ill or have been near anybody who is known to have had the virus, then there are no reasons why you should not be intimate. You can do whatever you want. There are other issues, however, and this is something that's really important to bring up in this podcast today, and that's the issue of taharat hamishpacha and going to the mikveh.
That was the next thing I was going to ask you about.
So I was going to ask you about this. I think we have to acknowledge something, at least in Israel where we live. The Misrad HaBriyut, which is the Ministry of Health, have come out with very, very specific guidelines in most areas of what is allowed, what is not allowed. The country clubs are closed, the gyms are closed, the swimming pools are closed, and there's only really very, very necessary services going on now.
Right.
The mikvahs are not closed, and there are guidelines about using the mikvahs. The men's mikvah, I understand.
The men's mikvah, I think, for different things depending on the mikvah, but women's mikvahs are open right now.
Now, here's the issue, and I've been talking to several people who are in the know about this. Last night, I had some communication with the Rabbanit, not married to a rabbi, Rabbanit, Eshet Halacha, a woman of Jewish knowledge, Sarah Segal-Katz, who instructs Kalot, and she's a Yoetzet Halacha, and she had written a Facebook post where she said, and I think that I have seen other posts by rabbis saying similar things, that she does not feel comfortable reassuring women that it's okay to go to the mikvah because we really can't guarantee 100% their safety. The reason being that as opposed to, let's say, hospitals, which is under the direct supervision of the Misrad Habriyut and is
the health
the
ministry.
Ministry of Health, the health ministry, and there are supervisors that come and check to make sure that everything is run according to procedure. There are lots of mikvaot, and they are basically run by the mikvah ladies, known here as the balaniyot. There are several issues here, including the fact that many balaniyot are at risk themselves because they're elderly. Many balaniyot in this country are older women. They can go out in the evenings, and many of them, this is their second career, so to speak. They're older, and they are at risk. What she was saying in the post was that there really isn't any responsibility being taken. And so practically speaking, there are women who are going to be afraid to go. And yes, there are guidelines. The Nishmat site has guidelines. The Eden Center came out with guidelines. And I'm sure those of you who are listening in the United States or other countries will have your own community guidelines. Having said that, there's really no guarantee that women can be kept 100% safe because there's no way to police it. The water itself and the chlorine itself, the virus doesn't live inside the water, but everything else around it.
There are surfaces there, of course.
Very careful. So my question for you is, women who don't want to go, they're afraid to go. What do you tell them? And can there be, for these women, some sort of permission to engage in non-sexual touch because of the situation?
That's a very difficult question. My initial reaction, without being an expert on this particular subject, is, frankly, unfortunately, no. From my understanding of how the halacha works, the basic way we look at Hilchot Nida is that having sexual intercourse is itself a Torah violation while a woman is in Nida, and that includes during the Sheva Nikim. There's no difference whether she's bleeding or whether she's waiting afterwards. As long as she's not gone to the mikvah, she is fully a Nida or a Zava, technically, whatever it is, given the situation. And if the couple have intercourse, they're chayav karet. That's excision. It's a very serious penalty. The other issue is that touching itself, or at least intimate touching, is, according to the Rambam, a Torah violation when she's in this state, before she's gone to the mikveh. And although the Ramban and others say it's not a Torah violation, we're still very, very strict about these issues. The larger issue that you're talking about now becomes, what about all the other harchakot? What about the various other restrictions that we have, which everyone agrees are not Torah violations? And in certain situations, we sometimes can be makil on them. For example, there's a very simple example. While a couple is in a state of nida, they don't pass things to each other directly. However, in a situation where that would cause an obvious violation of modesty, people would realize that they are in nida, then it's something which you can forego. The question is how far you can take that when it's not a matter of modesty, when there's no larger goal that overrides it beyond the couple's own intimate relationship. So in situations like that, it's something which I don't know the answer to. I don't know what to say in any given situation. I would feel reasonably comfortable with saying that intimate touch is forbidden, despite the fact that it's very, very difficult, no matter how long they have to wait. Now, when it comes to the harchakot and the possibility of being lenient in this area, I suppose I would have to speak to my own teachers about that and do my own research about that. And every individual should also speak with his or her halachic authority in order to determine if there's room to be lenient. I'll say this, Tali, because you are asking an important question. First of all, hopefully the situation will improve soon enough that this should not be a major problem for a long term. And second of all, even if it doesn't, hopefully the mikvaot will be able to be disinfected and adhere to specific guidelines that will be provided for them in such a way that people will not be afraid to go to the mikvaot. However, if, God forbid, this situation lasts longer and mikvaot are not able to adhere to specific guidelines such that women are still afraid to go to mikvaot, I think at that point, even though I'm not able to answer the question, there will be poskim who will take up the challenge and who will discuss these very, very important issues about when there is room and where there is room to be makil, to be lenient when it comes specifically to the area of harchakot, which are rabbinic in nature.
No, I understand. I think what might be important to tell women who are, like, for example, using birth control pills or using the NuvaRing, that if they are still not NIDA, they can extend the period of time that they're not NIDA, that this might be the time to push off your
Right.
period.
Right. I certainly
And
would
for
think
women
that's a
who
smart
aren't,
move because in this
yeah,
situation, if there's a way they can postpone their period, if in particular they're scared about going to the mikvah, then who knows how long it's going to last. So if they can postpone their period for longer, thereby allowing themselves to have a longer period of intimacy with their husbands, I think that would be a smart move, assuming that medically it's advisable.
of course. First of all, you must talk to your doctor. Don't just do these things without speaking with your physician. And I'm not giving any kind of medical clearance for this. And I know that there are people who ideally are not fans of using hormones. And even for women who are not using hormones, there's Primoletinor, there's certain pills that you can take, the kind of pills that you take before you get married, and you can postpone your period that way. So I think it's just important for women out there to just prepare by perhaps avoiding having to use the mikvah, avoiding getting into nida if you can. So that's just one thing I wanted to throw out there.
I also want to add that I saw Racheli Frankel, who is a Yoetzet Halacha, who teaches in Nishmat. She had a video on Facebook, and I think what she said is very important. She said that before we go to the mikveh, before we even get to that point, if a woman is in nida and is now ready for the Shiva Nikim, the 7 clean days, she should keep these, even if she's afraid of going to the mikveh. Now, Mrs. Frankel didn't say that. I'm adding that. But she said that a person should still keep these days on the assumption that hopefully by the time this person's ready to go to the mikveh, then everything will be okay, or there will be easier guidelines or whatever else. So I don't want to put words in her mouth, but she was saying that people should continue to keep the regular laws of nida, including the Shiva Nikim, checking herself and making sure that she's ready to go to the mikveh when it's time. It would be a shame if a woman is afraid to go to the mikveh. She chooses, therefore, not to check herself. And then, for whatever reason, restrictions are lifted. It's safer. We don't know when that will happen. And because she thought it was going to be longer, she didn't bother checking herself. And maybe now there are halachic issues with going to the mikveh as early as possible. So it might be smart, and I think it's advisable, that even if somebody's afraid about the situation and plans not to go to the mikveh, in all likelihood, they should still plan as if they're going to the mikveh, because who knows, Bezrat Hashem, it might be earlier than they think.
Okay, so let's answer your question about love and intimacy and sex in the time of Corona, and talk about what this situation potentially offers to couples in terms of sexuality and intimacy. There's a lot of talk about whether or not there's going to be a baby boom in 9 months from now. I think we have to remember that for many couples, having kids at home is really birth control in a sense, especially if you have older kids that you can't just tuck into bed at night. When you have older kids walking around the house at all hours, it gets very difficult to find time. That's true all year, but all year your older kids are not home every single night. Being able to find a time that's quiet. I read something from a doctor who's also a sex therapist. I think I sent it to you. I don't know if you had a chance to read it. And she said something like, turn on the washing machine and put on some music. Or, I mean, to me, it sounds pretty obvious. I mean, obvious to the kids. By the way, the worst.
Mom's doing the laundry again.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so if kids have a sense that maybe their parents are involved in some intimacy with one another, I don't think that that's a tragedy for them to know that. Obviously, you don't want to be overly enthusiastic if it's going to totally embarrass them to hear you.
Of course.
But I don't know if it's the worst thing if you say to your kids, like, we're going to bed, good night, and don't bother us to, I mean, I think that most kids understand or don't think about it or don't want to think about it.
Or don't want to think about it, I think, is probably the most likely reaction.
Yeah. But I think that people need to be able to think about the changing meaning of sex for them. I think some people can only have sex when they are really relaxed and are not used to a different kind of sex, which is sex that you have to kind of get relaxed, or a kind of vitality type of sex that in times of crisis where you don't know existentially who's going to live or die, it's something that people want to do in order to validate their vitality and their ability to enjoy and to live life to the fullest. So I think that for some people, there might be a change in the way they experience sex. They might be less rigid with the rules that they held on to and might be able to be flexible in terms of their rigid no's. The rigid no's, like, no, we never do it when it's a Tuesday night and the kids are home. And I'm like, of course, we're not going to have sex tonight. But things might change.
So you're saying this could even be seen by some as an opportunity to go in different directions than they're used to?
It can absolutely be an opportunity. It can be an opportunity to try different things. It can be an opportunity if you make it an opportunity, but you have to talk about it with each other. You have to be able to say, what are we doing with this? Should we try to make it into an opportunity? And we also want to be able to appreciate all the different types of meanings that sex can have, because it's not just about enjoyment and pleasure. It's a big part of it, but sometimes it really is about existence. It's about feeling alive. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's about reducing stress. And sometimes it's about validating each other, and
I'm sure comforting each other, making each other know that you're there.
Exactly. I think that one may learn to appreciate the variety or different meanings than what they've done before, or how they've done it before, or how they've experienced it before.
Okay, Tali, so do you have any specific and direct tips for couples at this time?
So one thing I would say is that to whatever extent possible, try to keep according to some sort of schedule in terms of waking up in the morning, whether you daven or exercise. I know that there's some different opinions about going out for walks. We fortunately have a treadmill. Not everyone has that. These days you've got YouTube videos, and I just had a yoga session this morning on Zoom where our yoga class actually met, so we didn't have to miss our yoga. It's really important to exercise, and hygiene is really important, and it's important for relationships. Nobody wants to touch a partner who hasn't bothered to shower in 3 days because they didn't go anywhere. So paying attention to things like that. Get dressed. Don't just sit around in your sweats all day. You'll feel better if you get dressed. I'm doing my therapy on Skype or on FaceTime or whatever medium. And, it's very tempting to just not bother getting dressed if you're not going to go anywhere. And I think it's important to feel your best and to keep some sort of what they call here shigra, which means
a routine.
Routine, yeah, which is funny because we're all completely out of routine. The whole world is out of routine.
We all know that when we go do our work, whether it's over Skype or whether it's writing, whether it's a project, if we do that in our pajamas, It just changes the whole feel that it's not serious.
Right. It's true. It's true for people who work at home in general. When this first started out and people were talking about social distancing, and they were talking about how awkward it is to meet people and not shake their hands and not hug. And I thought to myself, well, welcome to our life. This is how we were kind of raised, at least with people of the opposite sex. And now we're being shomer with everybody. And the world is practicing being shomer with everybody. And in a way, we are in a position to have learned already how to connect to other people, whether it's intimate connection or just connection with members of the opposite sex without touching, to be able to use eye contact. Because you can't resort to touch or you can't use touch, you learn how to communicate with people by expressing your emotions verbally. And that's a skill that not everybody has. So there's a certain kind of interesting quality to that. I think that there's also the understanding, and this is important for many religious couples, that there are so many different types of touch. There are people who are at home in their homes and they're by themselves and they don't have contact with other people. And there's almost a skin hunger that you can develop. When we talk about love and sex in the time of Corona, we are obviously talking about, in general, our podcast deals with sex between married couples, even though we have addressed what it's like for single people. And I think that the world at large is experiencing a very meaningful shift. I was reading about how Tinder apps are changing. Hooking up all over the world is changing. Dating, because of the restrictions on physical contact,
Right.
not just the standing apart, but, the goodbye, hug and kiss, or the hookup that happens at the end, or whatever it is. So this is something that's really affecting everybody, the whole world.
And as you said, it could be an opportunity to learn how to communicate in non-physical ways, which is obviously very important in its own.
Well, I think that the way the world had been headed has been very much about technology, and people have been in their phones, and there has been a worldwide decrease in sexual relations among millennials. There was some research that came out a few years ago about that. I think that what's really important, another important tip, and this has to do with partners, but it also has to do with intimacy and communication in families. We need to be able to set aside times every day without screens, without phones. People are getting notifications every minute, and they really raise anxiety when you see the numbers going up and you find out who is the next person who you know who has the virus. And sometimes you just need to take a break. So whether it's taking a bubble bath, turning off your phone, getting together to have some family time, watching a movie. Obviously, everybody can use this opportunity to clean out closets and clean out drawers for Pesach. The timing just, is kind
Perfect
of
or imperfect, but
perfect for that.
it's what it is.
However you want to look at it, it's whatever it is. I don't think that I'm saying too many new things. I think that this stuff has been out there in all the media, but
I think it's very important for people to hear. The same way I'll bring in a well-known textual reference that the Mesilat Yesharim by the Ramchal, at the very beginning, he says in this famous Musar book, I'm not going to tell anybody anything you don't already know. But the things that we already know are the things we most often need to be reminded of, because they're the things that we stick at the back of our minds too often and don't really have consciously in front of us. So I think it's very important what you're saying.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't hurt. There's somebody out there who might take some comfort, hopefully, in our message.
And I feel very strongly in particular about what you said when it comes to screen time, because I'm not against screen time, but I am very against screen time at, for example, the dinner table. With my kids, we were talking today as we were having lunch. I have a hashtag, no screens at the table. One of my sons took out his phone. So my other said, no screens at the table. Remember the hashtag. And I also have, not that long ago, a few months ago, I officially put all my notifications on silent so that if I'm talking to somebody and someone tries to notify me, I won't be distracted and wondering what was that ding I just heard on my phone. Instead, once I'm done talking to somebody, if I think maybe someone notified me, I can take it out and I'll say, oh, good, I have a notification. But when I'm talking to somebody, I don't want to be thinking about what that other person wants or what someone just told me or, God forbid, what serious thing just happened in the world. I think for our interpersonal relations, the idea of talking to somebody, trying to put your notifications on silent, I think is actually something which should be done more often. Because even if you're not going to pick it up, you're still thinking about what that was, and it can make a little damper in the conversation. That's my take on that.
So I think that what we can all be cognizant of is that this is a time of crisis. And when we're in crisis, we tend to kind of regress to our survival selves. And what we want to be really aware of, when things are great, when we're all making money and the kids are in school, we look around us and we see who needs chesed, and, we can go out there and do things for other people. When everybody's in crisis, people begin to kind of concentrate on what their own needs are. And we don't have that privilege of worrying about others. That's kind of what survival begins to look like. When we are with our partners, just like we want to be able to stay as aware of friends of ours who might be stuck at home, get on Skype and reconnect with people who who might be alone at home and lonely and afraid. This is intimacy, being able to speak with them live on FaceTime or Skype and offer your friendship or reconnect. We need to be connecting with each other on as human a level as possible. And with our spouses, we really need to connect with them, check in with each other. How are you doing? Even if you're working, you're still at work and you're working in separate areas of the house, have coffee breaks together, have lunch together, invite whatever kids are home to have lunch together. And, don't fight over who's going to do the dishes, because these are not times that it makes sense to get into these silly bickering arguments. That's only going to escalate and contribute to your kids feeling even less safe. So kind of taking things easy and trying to make the most of the family time.
Right. And it's ironic that we as a community, as a larger Jewish community, value community so much. And now we're in a time when we really can't have any real community. Everyone's essentially stuck or quarantined at home. Our community life has been completely upended. But at the same time, what you're saying, and I think this is absolutely true, our need to be cognizant of everybody outside the four walls of our houses is even greater than in the past. Even though our physical community has been impeded, we don't have the ability to be together physically, our emotional connection with other people has to be heightened, whether it's the emotional connection of people in our own house and also the emotional connection with people outside of our house. And I'll even say, even outside of the Jewish community, in ways that haven't usually been common, I see people in the Jewish community concerned about the fate of the entire world in a very lovely and wonderful way. There's a tefillah which was suggested by the Rosh Yeshiva at the Yeshiva in Gush at Har Etzion, which the Rav of Maishel, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, suggested that everybody say in Shema Kolenu. It's the Avinu Malkeinu that is said at the end of Musaf on Rosh Hashanah and at the end of every tefillah on Yom Kippur during Chazarat Hashatz. And it says Zechor Rachamecha, and then we ask God to take away any magefa, any plague, or any machala, any sickness. And they added the words, not just V'al Kol Amecha, they added V'al Kol Ha'olam, and on the entire world.
That's what I did.
And exactly as you said before, and that's exactly the point. We are now in some ways a global community, and I think it's important to look outside our Dalet Amot, our own intimate spaces, to have respect and concern for people outside of our house and outside of the Jewish community too. In a certain sense, all of humanity is in this together, and if we use that as an opportunity, maybe it will have far-reaching consequences that will be positive.
Scott, I really hope that next time we meet to do a podcast, that this is all behind us.
I certainly hope that as well. We certainly are praying and thinking about those people who are in quarantine, who are sick, and who need refuah shlema. So, Bezrat Hashem, everyone will be cured soon, and all of us will go back to a normal shigra, a normal routine, quicker rather than being here for too long. But whatever happens, it should only happen in such a way that more lives are saved and fewer people get sick. Thank you, everybody, for listening to Intimate Judaism. Remember, again, to visit our website, intimatejudaism.com. We will have show notes there. Please tell people about this podcast. Visit our Facebook page. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn with Tali Rosenbaum. Thanks for joining us.